Hello and welcome to the Compliance Catch-Up, which is where I get to chat with the movers and shakers in the compliance industry, RegTech and FinTech, to get some good ideas and hopefully a wider understanding of the market in which I play. My name is James Hogbin. I'm the CEO of Fingerprint Supervision, which is a compliance automation platform for communication supervision. And with me today, I have the industry legend, that is Clare Curtis, who is the CEO of Effecta Compliance. Clare, would you like to introduce yourself?
Gosh, after that, I'm not sure I do. A mover and shaker and a legend, that's something to be holding.
Or a legendary mover and shaker.
A legendary mover and shaker. Well, yeah, that might be an evening out, I guess. But so my name's Clare Curtis, and I'm the CEO of Effecta Compliance. And we're a boutique compliance consultancy firm based in London and also in the Middle East.
Very good. How have you become the CEO of Effecta? What's your journey been from, I guess, university onwards? How's that worked?
Yeah, well, probably, as you know, James, there's very few people in this world that wake up and say, one day I'd love to be a compliance officer. Although actually Jade in my Middle East office, she actually did wake up and want to be a compliance officer. So there is proof there. I think I came through the usual route, which was, law degree. You either get compliance officers who've done law or they've done accounting or something like that. So I went the law route. At the time, I'm probably giving away my age here, but my first job was at Midland Bank. Yes, exactly. I know. I've got a very good hairdresser. At Midland, I went into something called trust services, which was my first introduction to the fact there was even this world of compliance. But I already knew that I loved the city and I loved London and I loved the vibe. And, I went to the stock exchange, even when they had a floor, so probably still giving away a few hints here. But I loved being in that kind of environment. And it was the first time that I was exposed to the fact that there was these controls that kind of played to my legal brain as well. So I sort of ended up, as most people do, kind of falling into compliance. And then it was the route through to London Stock Exchange, investment banking in London, and ultimately kind of led to my move to the Middle East, which originally was to go out there and actually help set up the Dubai Mercantile Exchange. Which was, where else in the world do you get the opportunity to set up a commodities exchange in an oil-rich country as well? So it's a massive experience, but it was just at the time that Dubai was starting to create its own financial centers. People were coming in. So from there, I kind of led straight into that consultancy world, which is where I've now been for the last sort of probably close to 20 years, I guess.
Fantastic. And so Effecta, a little background on Effecta as an organization. How did that come into being? How's it doing? How's it growing?
Yeah, I mean, it's growing, and numbers of people are growing because it has to, and it's an incredibly exciting time for us. But the reality is, when I was in the Middle East in consultancy, it was an incredibly enjoyable space. But anybody that's listening to this that's in a consultancy environment also know it's quite high pressured. No client understands that there are other clients that you're dealing with. So, you're constantly battling with that, and also with the time differences, some people in the US and some people in the Far East, etc. So the idea actually, when I came back to the UK, which was 3 years ago, was very much just to take the step back. I had a small human, and small human needed to get into school, but very quickly realized that I'd probably get quite bored and not very good at baking and no interest in gardening, so didn't know what else to do. And actually one of my old clients suggested that I set up a consultancy firm in London. And my first question was, well, why? because there's a huge, as you know, James, there's a huge community here of compliance officers, compliance consultants, all different shapes and sizes. Why would you want another one? And it was really interesting, the feedback. And having been in the UK for a little bit, I sort of get it, in the fact that when I was in the UAE, we were very much on the register for firms. So we were the compliance officer, what is now the SMF 1617 in the UK, and created a very different relationship with our clients.
So it's kind of like the US with the CCO outsourcing, right? Where in the UAE, you can be the compliance officer for a number of different firms, whereas obviously the FCA say, unless it's a group, you're the SMF 16 and exclusively for that organization, right? So that model doesn't work in the UK, hence regulatory hosting, I guess.
Absolutely right, and the regulatory hosting provides at least that alternative, which is, something that maybe the UAE might grow into, but doesn't have at the moment. And having that kind of relationship with a firm means that you are their compliance officer. And so there's no point in going in and just doing a checkbox of, do you have this control? Do you have that control? Have you done training? You have to go in and you have to really understand the business. You have to work with the people. And if there's a change of regulation, you have to implement that change in that business. So you don't go to somebody else and write a 20-page report and then someone else miraculously makes it happen.
So does that mean in the UAE, if you're doing it, you have the fiduciary duty as the compliance officer to the firm that you're working for? So are you seconded into that firm, or is it a contractual relationship? And if you decide not to do it, what happens to that firm? Are they still regulated without you, or how does that all work?
Yeah, so it is very contractual. And of course, just to add to complexity, in the UAE, you have to have a visa, a residency visa and a working visa. So you can't have multiple visas. And so hence why with these kind of consultancies, you're on the visa of that consultant, but contractually, you are the compliance officer and over there it's up to 5 firms that you can be a compliance officer for. So you go onto the register. It's a mandatory function, just like it is in the UK. But interestingly enough, there they wouldn't allow, for instance, what we call the CEO, they call the SEO. They wouldn't allow that person to hold that function. So it very much is a very individual that needs to hold the function.
I kind of think that's a good idea. I'm always a little uncertain in the UK where the boss goes, "Oh, I'll do the SMF 16," and you're thinking, "Well, hang on a minute. They're supposed to be independent. They're not supposed to be paid on the performance of the business. So how can you be the CEO and the compliance person? Because there are different things." I kind of like that.
Yeah, I must admit, I do too. And I've also,
anybody from the FCA, that would be a good rule.
A very good idea, exactly. But I've also sort of, having been away for such a long time, I've also come back with certain expectations of the UK system. So one of those expectations was very much that key man risk would certainly be a top priority.
Key person risk.
Key person risk. We'll talk about diversity next, right?
That's a key person nowadays.
Key person risk. Exactly.
Our careers will be over.
I know. So that key person risk, and I've seen those smaller firms here that have, their SEO, their compliance officer, CAS, but basically like 1 or 2 individuals holding all of these roles. And the question has to be, well, how does that work properly in these kind of dynamic environments?
Would you then suggest that below a certain size, things like regulatory hosts and principals should be mandated, right? If you're a 5-person firm, you don't have the chops to do compliance properly. You should go and find somebody that does know how to do it and be under their umbrella until you grow.
I mean, I don't know whether mandated is the right word, because there are small firms that actually do it really, really well, and there also can be ones that are very low risk. And actually, when you drill below the surface and the right people are in the right places and there's the right oversight, it can be done. Is it a good idea? Absolutely. I think that for firms to really take regulation seriously costs a lot of money. And I know when we speak to firms about the sort of startup process, not having that option of an all-encompassing type of umbrella, it can sometimes be very off-putting for them to actually enter the market, or they enter the market on a shoestring and they don't do it right. So it is quite a nice way of sort of almost putting the training wheels on, and getting them up and running, getting their reputation out there, building their business without the worry or overheads of all the infrastructure that comes with this sort of thing. So I think it's a great idea. I also think it comes with risks as well. And, you've already seen what happens when it can go wrong as well, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Name no names. Let's not get into trouble on this so early into the
yeah.
So I've hijacked it on regulatory bits. What are you seeing in the market as the key things? Obviously, you have a very interesting perspective because the Middle East seems to be a much better jurisdiction for money managers. There's more people opening there. They're migrating money there. They're taking the choice to say, we don't want to be FCA regulated, BaFin regulated, whatever the French regulator is, I forget, regulated. Do they have a regulator? Do they have a funds industry? I don't know. They do. We're really big, right? Nothing
huge, right?
Yeah, whatever. Europe. And so, what are you seeing that's happening here that's driving people to UAE, Saudi, ADGM, even if that's a thing? I don't know. It was a pipe dream. I don't know if that's there yet. Is that a thing now?
It really is a thing, yeah.
It really is a thing. Wow.
It really is a thing. I know, exactly. I think Saudi is the one that we're all watching and sort of going couple of years, and then gosh, who knows what's going to happen over there. It's one of those potential huge opportunities that nobody kind of wants to take a first step into yet. But as we know with the Middle East, they have a lot of money, and they make decisions very quickly, and so these things can happen very quickly. I think the interesting, if you like, perception maybe that I can bring with me is that having been away for 15 years and then come back, certain things that I expected to have been eroded have not been as eroded as I expected.
For instance, what in terms of ... question mark? What hasn't been eroded?
Well, so there's a few things. One is that I expected that, if you like, the old boys club, the old boys network was a bit of a thing of the past, right? That wasn't really how it worked anymore. And certainly I think we've all kind of moved through the times to appreciate the fact that it doesn't really work. And actually, having a much more open playing field and diversity of people, it makes a much better corporate, it makes a much better financial, it makes a much better economic environment. So those things do not exist anymore. And actually, they do. They really do. I remember thinking, there used to be a lot, especially in the asset management world, there's, whoever the partner was that didn't come to that particular partnership meeting, they were the ones that got nominated to be the compliance officer. And that was it. And that's how it worked. And I was like, well, that obviously doesn't happen anymore because, the FCA is a big regulator. They have proper rules, they have systems, they have enforcement. And then having come back, I feel like there's a certain level of firm, maybe in the slightly smaller categories, who feel like the FCA are not really going to be bothered about them. What they do is not significantly important to the economy and to that financial services world. That the last time they visited us was probably 8 years ago, if at all. And actually, nobody's really complaining, and we all know what we're doing. So it doesn't really need the change.
So I had a very interesting chat with a enforcement head. I don't think it was a head of enforcement, senior enforcement chap in the FCA at an event I was doing. And I said, why don't you crack down on the smaller wrongdoers? And he said, I don't need to. Like, why not? He said, because we crack down on the big ones. Okay. And the little ones will look at us cracking down on the big ones and be scared. It's like, no. They just think you're cracking down on the big ones and they're immune. No. That's not the message we're sending. We are sending the fact that if we can go after these people with loads of lawyers, then we can go after anybody. And I said, but the message you're actually giving is you don't care about anybody sub tier 1, tier 2, and they're just merrily doing what they do and paying absolutely zero regard to anything you say or do, because it's irrelevant to them, because they don't see themselves managing half a billion of assets.
Yeah.
And you're going after Barclays for an infringement on WhatsApp or whatever it happens to be, because fish and bicycles.
Yeah, it is so true. I have to say though, there's two clients I'm dealing with at the moment where they've kind of fallen into that malaise, if that's the right word, where they've not really been doing like their SMF applications, for instance, and their grandfathering process. You've picked it up and you go, good grief, this is basically a Form A with not much more there, a little bit statement of responsibilities, which takes like 3 lines on a piece of paper. It's not good enough. But they're not taking it seriously enough until the regulator actually does come through the door. Or what's happened in one of the other firms, they've actually got themselves into a bit of financial difficulty. Guess what? They've had to bring in some heavy hitters who are going to sit there now on the governing board and ask the right questions. And I think, that message needs to get out much more than, the fine on Barclays for like systems and controls failures around AML and that sort of thing is, it's good press headlines. But the real consumer harm, it's more than just the Barclays banks. It's more than the HSBCs or the high street names. There are plenty of firms there who are providing really top quality services to retail clients, as well as institutions, obviously, that actually do need to make sure that they are there. But there are the others that are sort of muddying the waters somewhat because they feel like nobody's really going to come and check on them. So as long as they get someone in, like a consultant, to come in and tick the boxes every couple of months, great, they're probably okay.
I also think that the consultants have a hard enough time because the FCA never tell people what they're doing. So if you do an FOI request and you say, what are you working on? They say, oh, we did 412 enforcement actions last year. And you're thinking, blimey, that's 4 a week, pretty much. Yes. What were they? Can't tell you.
No.
Well, so where are you focusing? What are you looking at? Because as a compliance consultant, you go and you say, oh, it's all about, I don't know, D&I. We need to do stuff about inclusion and culture because the FCA are talking about it. Yeah, but the FCA aren't doing anything about it.
Yeah.
Well, it may be one of those 400 cases. No, it might not be.
Yeah.
Until the FCA is more open about thematically telling us, we've taken enforcement in these from maybe stirate it into small firms of less than 20 people, firms of 20 to 100 people, 100 to 300 people. We've got D&I, misconduct, oversight, SMF, AML, whatever. And here's a matrix of all of the cases that we've looked at. Because otherwise, it's almost impossible, A, to advise people, B, to have firms go, the FCA is taking this seriously. Because if you look at their weekly send out, they're knocking off a couple of motor sellers that haven't filled in the forms correctly, or an IFA mortgage dealer. Nothing about the wholesale market, asset management, nothing. We know they're in there because there's 166's people, there's a business for it. Deloitte's wouldn't exist in their financial services practice unless they had something to do. So clearly they're doing something because they're enormous. So something's going on there that we don't know about, because unless the FCA tells us, it's almost impossible to advise a client.
Yeah, I think also, I think clients, don't get me wrong, I know I'm a compliance consultant. There are many positives and there are many negatives about employing consultants, right? And we all know that. But one of the key positives is at least having a handle on what's going on around the market a bit more. So we tend to get called in, which is probably what we're seeing the most of, is that sort of step before a 166. So they've let it get to a point where it's actually that bad that they have actually popped up above the radar. And guess what? Their controls are not strong enough. They're not adequate. And things have happened and documents are out of date and all the rest of it. And they suddenly think, oh, gosh, if we don't do something now, we're actually into that 166 territory, which number one is going to be expensive. Number two, as soon as it gets out in the market, could kill the business anyway, and equally could have certain personal ramifications. So, goodness me, we probably ought to get someone in to look at this stuff properly. And I think that's where I've seen in the consultancy world in the UK, where there's so many different offerings that you actually need to get the right consultant for your business. So, sometimes the smaller businesses that employ the really big consultants, they don't necessarily get the attention that they require. And equally, the smaller firms...
but they get the bills they deserve. So, it evens itself out.
Yeah, maybe they don't want to pay as well. These are the other sort of sides of the negative sides of the consultancy. But I think the ones that we're also seeing is where you get the firms that have identified, a compliance officer that were an individual, if you will, who's coming in and, assisting that SMF 16, 17 by just doing like a bit of regular monitoring or something to keep them ticking over. But that's probably not good enough to really get firms compliant unless they've got a really good internal structure anyway, in which case you can come in and just make sure everything's working.
Certainly SysGate allows that to happen, right? So you can outsource the delivery but not the responsibility, and it tells you how to do it. You've got to predefine the KPIs. You've got to keep an understanding of what's going on. You've got to keep the knowledge to be able to manage people who are there. But you can say, I'm the SMF 16, but actually what's being done here is entirely outsourced, but safe under SysGate because I'm allowed to. I'm in control. I've set the KPIs. I can manage it, but it's all being done by Effecta or whoever happened to do it. So it's not a model that the regulators haven't contemplated. I just don't think it's often a SysGate type engagement. Somebody just goes, oh, can you come in and tell us some stuff? And I think it's much better off if I'm sorry?
Has anything changed in the regulatory world that we need to be aware of? There's only like these 101 consultation papers, that require quite a lot of work, but don't worry too much about them because they're probably not going to look at them for another year, right? So
I have a theory about there we go about why why firms change their opinion about compliance. My theory is this: the FCA is short-staffed because government doesn't ever want to pay for correct regulators or tax collectors or whatever because they're deemed to be a cost. So they're short-staffed. So they put quite a gate on getting in to be regulated. And then they realize that in the wholesale market, at least, that every time money comes and goes from a fund or into an infrastructure or a P or a VC, there's a due diligence that gets done. Family offices insist on it. Large banks insist on it. When you're doing your ISDA, they want to see all sorts of things. So the FCA know that there's a whole load of checkpoints with companies that will turn up and tick back to their rule book before money is allowed into a strategy or a fund or a wherever. And so they're relatively sanguine in the wholesale space that because there are these due diligence providers that are key to the money flow in and out, and they know that those due diligence providers will be ticking back to a regulatory handbook. If the tick is across, then they kind of assume that the money won't go in and the funds want the money, so they'll go and get a compliance consultant to make that cross a tick. And that's how they sort of do it. So what we see when we get called into funds is quite often they haven't raised the money they thought they were going to because they failed due diligence. not because a regulator's turned up and gone,
Yeah.
you have got the control framework for supervising email and voice because you're SIS 10A. Normally, it's one of the major due diligence providers that say, you've got SIS 10A and you're not doing anything. We're not allowing our fund to allocate to you.
Yeah, I think investors have a huge power. But as you say, most of that power sits with those institutional investors rather than with the mums and pups or the smaller levels of the investor world. So I think certainly in the wholesale market there is a little bit, but even just as you're sort of explaining it, this is one of the things that I've really sort of grappled with for the UK, which is a sort of, can we go through this list? And so, I've been working with the sort of a few other consultancy firms and things like that, and everybody has a checklist. And it kind of blows my mind a little bit. I pretty much never have a checklist because I always want to go in and say, right, okay, well, what are you doing? How are you doing it? How do you make sure that actually works? So we have the conversation, well, here's my manual. Thank you very much. Here's my training that I've done. And here's my log. If there's any sort of anomalies that I need to record. And you go, oh, that's fantastic. That all looks great. So how do you actually make sure that what you've written in your procedures is being followed? Well, we've done the training. Okay. Have you actually checked to make sure that people actually are following these requirements? Because otherwise you're probably not going to pick up on too much for that log of yours that you've got there. And so I think, there's a lot of that surface review. And I think, we're never going to have masses of clients because it's not our model, if you like. But our model is much more about, and this is where sort of perhaps my Middle East thinking is that I'm much more involved in the business. I'm not necessarily going to be invited to the Christmas party, but
you never invite compliance to the Christmas party.
We have our own Christmas party, right? Because we're there with the finance team basically. And so yeah, exactly. Having our bottle of wine in the staff room or something.
Yes.
But we should be involved with them. They should have the ability to ask a question about what's really happening and how it's all working, and then work with them to get the right answer rather than just giving them a report and saying, oh, off you go, this is all the things that you need to change, let us know, and in a year's time we'll come back in and we'll check against that report to make sure you've actually done it. And I don't know why
what are the key areas? So if I were a helpless investment client, which I would be should I set one up, what are the key thrusts? Which areas are you looking at the minute? What's important to the regulator? Where would you be advising me to take action in my compliance frameworks?
I think there's two probably key areas, and then below that there's these little subsections, if you will. I think one of the key things is the SMFs, a corporate governance arrangement, how that actually works, and the oversight of the firm and decision making. And some of this then leads to some of the other points that have been coming through. I mean, we've recently had much more of a push on diversity and inclusion and the reporting around that. We've also had that kind of push on ESG is a very popular topic, but then there's the greenwashing is the other side. So how do you make sure that you've got that proper framework in place? And it's got to start at the top. It's got to start with the right people in the right places. And it's no longer a case, and people really need to move away from this. It's no longer a case that you've just grandfathered all these people over and there's a Form A that sits there. That's not the case anymore. And you need to be thinking as well wider than just your firm, if you can get to that kind of level of thought, which is the economy, and say the need for disclosing of diversity and inclusion, but then it then starts to creep into general conduct, and it's not just financial misconduct. We've had a bit push on non-financial misconduct. how are you properly monitoring what is going on in your business? And do you have the right people in the right places? And if there are skills gaps, that's okay. But how are you going to fill those gaps? How are you going to support that person? I think that you've got to get that right, to get the business right, to get the model right. And then I think on the other side to that is AML, which is never going to go away, and continues to be an issue, but also one that perhaps, once again, and apologies for keep referring, but with a Middle East hat on, I'm probably slightly more sensitive to than people in the UK system who have always believed that the UK AML environment is so much more stringent than anywhere else around the world that, you know, we're probably okay, and anywhere else we go, we're probably super equivalent. And actually, that's just not the case, and it's got a bit lazy. And I do
here or in
here for sure.
Here. So there's a number of things to unpack in what you've just said.
Sorry, yes, I know I kind of threw it all at you.
3 or 4 meaty things. Now, on the D&I ESG greenwashing stuff, I'm slightly torn. Obviously, we do supervision tools to allow people to look at the communications canons and trading patterns and that sort of thing. And so part of what we provide in the tool set is the ability to look at sales conduct, cliques, all of that sort of thing, to check that the cultures and values of the organization is being driven all the way through to the communications they have with clients and vendors and the rest of it, because we can scan for all of that stuff.
Yeah.
But there's another part of me, the slightly more libertarian tear it all down part, that says the regulator is there to protect investors, and it's to protect investors from chalk stripe suited braced spivs in the city, from selling 90-year-old 20-year term products and that sort of thing. And their job is to make sure that money doesn't get laundered, the products are marketed in a legal, decent and true manner, and the bad guys doing the wrong things get disbarred and put in stocks and having things thrown at them. The regulator shouldn't be telling anybody how to behave culturally. So things like diversity and inclusion, I care about my return. I want a return. Regulator, regulate my return. Regulate the conduct around giving me a return. Don't get involved in the culture of the business. I don't mind. I want my return. ESG, you can't regulate that. I can choose to buy ESG, I could choose not to buy ESG, and ESG has some rules and there's a body that does it, but you can't say you've got a net zero target because we're a regulator, which is kind of what they've been doing. While we provide the tools to do it, I'm somewhat uneasy that the regulator is involved in those areas when they don't seem to be doing a very good job of what they should be doing, which is locking up spivs.
Gosh, that's a little
I do
odd.
hope nobody from the FCA is watching this, or else
Have we vetted the audience first? So, James, can I be completely honest? I think you're showing your age now.
Yeah, maybe I am. Yeah,
and I think
23. It's a horrible age.
It's a horrible age, and I think you're just in that cusp of understanding how the economy benefits and how
you get to tell me off like my daughter does, and you're going to say you don't understand.
You just don't understand, right? And we'll all be buying everything in crypto in about a year's time. So
right. That don't get me started on
crypto. we won't get on the crypto conversation, I promise. Look, I sort of understand. To be fair, there have been points where I think, good grief, you've gone as far as looking at individuals' personal lives and what they're putting on their social media pages to determine whether they're fit and proper as individuals to hold certain positions in the financial services industry.
Well, I kind of get that, because that co-op bloke that took all the money and was supposed to be in charge of Co-op Bank and wasn't, his personal behaviour wasn't all that. And Barclays have had an issue with that recently. But again, is it a regulatory matter?
Do you know what?
You can't do your job. Yes, it is. But
I think you got to look at it a little bit wider. I mean, look, there's been a long time where we've been, at least in the UK, on a principles-based regulatory system, right?
Yeah,
Which
I
is
guess if it's principles based.
outside of all of the, this is the rule and this is, and I think as well the world is changing. I think to a degree, COVID has probably pushed that forward, in sometimes in a good way and sometimes not. But I think people are actually starting to their values and the importance that they put on things and how the economy is going to develop, which ultimately will lead to better returns. That I think is what the regulator is trying to encourage. Is it 100% regulatory? Rather, we obviously want to build an economy that is a strong economy that encourages people that encourages good business. And we can't deny that diversity and inclusion has to be a good thing, given the diverse nature of the population that we live in, the different requirements that different people have. Those spivs in the pinstripe suit, they're all going to sit on their board and they're all going to go, do you know what, all we need to do, lads, is we just need to turn a good profit, and guess what, all of our guys are going to be very happy back there. Jolly good, let's all go and pat ourselves on the back. It's more than that now, right? And I think people are expecting more than that. And I think that's why when we talk about some of the stuff coming through from the FCA, consumer duty or the duty, we're now shifting to harms, not just the controls, but what's the harm if the control is not there? Diversity and inclusion, what stops when you don't have that, and you don't actually get that progressive society? And certainly with ESG, there's too many people are jumping on the bandwagon, and that's the problem, not the ESG. We've all got to appreciate that the world we want to continue to live in, we have to do something. I don't think anybody really denies that, unless you're probably Donald Trump or something. But you want to make sure that you're creating that profit in the right way. And I think there are some firms that are doing it incredibly well. But as with everything, there's also then those firms that just jump on the bandwagon and they don't really do it properly.
So how's the regulator going to detect that? Because that strikes me as being a moral judgment rather than a physical judgment. So you can only checkbox it, right? And if you pass the checkboxes, if you're doing it morally cynically or because you really believe in it, the outcome is the same. So what does the regulator bring to that? A set of checkboxes, right? It makes me uneasy when there's a morality to a regulator rather than our job is to protect consumers or whatever their mission happens to be, to read the Daily Mail and respond to people's complaints page or whatever it is that drives the FCA. Anyway, probably not that. The other thing that you mentioned was skills gaps and the fact that people have grandfathered in and the world has changed and all the rest of it, which is a fairly large thematic, right? Because a lot of people, I guess, and you alluded to earlier, I'm showing my age. Obviously, there's a lot of people that have spent a lifetime in this business that think they know what's going on and clearly don't. They're left behind by D&I, ESG, TikTok, whatever the other things are. And yet they are just grandfathering straight through into this brave new world of SMF and tech and different business models and this, that, and the other. Do you think it's the regulator's duty to help there or just state what the obligations are and kick it to consultants or the firms to deal with?
I think the regulator still needs to be the regulator. I've been through a sort of a developing regulatory structure where, there was a stage where consultants and regulators were kind of all in it together, and, we were sort of working for the right cause, for the right results.
Sorry, did you want the motor?
Anywho, but as a market matures, there has to be that separation, and there's only a certain amount that the regulator can prescribe before you start going much more that American route. And with the best will in the world, trying to keep up with American regulations, it's very, very prescriptive, and it doesn't, in my view anyway, produce necessarily the end result. It comes back to this sort of tick box type mentality, right? So I think they need to be able to provide you with enough tools to be able to comply and know roughly what it is they're looking for and what their end goals are. But they're never going to be able to really be as prescriptive or help them as much to get to that result, because every firm is different. And I think that sort of also goes to that whole point about these tick box type reviews, is that every firm has to be different, because otherwise they're never going to get business. Every firm at least believes that they have some sort of USP, whether that's an individual, whether that's a strategy, where whatever it is, they do see that they are individual. And don't get me wrong, I've written many a business plan where I've kind of said, wow, look at this is amazing, so unique, and then I pick up the next business plan and I go, gosh, that looks just the same, but I'm sure they must have something. Ultimately, how things work, how things are perceived, and those practical elements, every firm is very, very different. So I don't think the regulator could move to that type of environment. It's not big enough to control what it has to control now, let alone really doing that.
And yet they've brought in the SM and CR regime with SMFs, utterly broadened who it was, because it used to be the top 2 or 3. You had 1, 2, and 3 who managed it. You had 16 and 17 that looked after it, and you had 20 and 30 that sold it. And you did some exams and you became one or the other, and that was it.
Yeah.
But now and they were the only people that judged on all 12, 13 principles, whistleblowing being that sort of floaty
Is it
one.
really? Is it not? Yeah.
Really? And everybody else had the first 4 because it was a financial business. But now with the SM and CR, pretty much you can be the head of IT support and have an SMF type role, which means you're bound by the 12 principles. And I don't understand how the FCA, with its paucity of resources in this area, thought that expanding this, and obviously to prevent the grandfathering of badly skilled people, but all of a sudden they've broadened the remit. And so what they do now is, here are the exclusions from the people that have a role that's bound by the principles and this, that, and the other. It just strikes me as being a massive own goal on their part, because they can't enforce it. Therefore, everybody thinks, well, they're not enforcing it, and therefore, what's the point?
Do you know, I think that's true on the sort of the grandfathering element. I think what's happening now is that there are now changes to the SMFs. So people are leaving, new people are coming through. And those people that are coming through are now really going through a detailed process. I think if nothing else, going through that process gives people the opportunity to go, whoa, hold on a second, I didn't realize quite how much of a responsibility I was going to have. Am I comfortable with that? Whereas before it was just filling a form, really, and a little bit off the races. Whereas now things like, I think the most recent one we've just done, a CEO, is actually a very well qualified, very well regarded CEO. And he had about a 15-page skills gap analysis that sat behind it. And to start with, I looked at it and thought, gosh, this seems a bit overkill. But as we went through it with them, a lot of it made a huge amount of sense. And the guy was like, do you know what? That's actually has helped me to focus on the things that I need to be focusing on. But also now I'm going to look at my guys sitting with me on the board, my Neds and that sort of thing, and saying, well, okay, do we all really need to be thinking a bit more about this? So it might not be that the regulator is able to do as much as they want, but there is a certain amount of self-regulation by forcing people to think. And I think that's an important element that perhaps wasn't there quite so much before.
Indeed. And the other thing that you alluded to, which is quite a biggie, was the AML and KYC, us versus the Middle East. and your contention that it was laxer here than it was in the Middle East, if I understood you correctly.
Yep.
Phew,
Yeah.
I did. So talk me through that, because the bane of most people's lives is AML, KYC, MLRO, segmentation. Can I be the same person? So in my experience, people take it relatively seriously in the setup phase. And then they outsource it all. Obviously, it's the first Sysgate thing you ever do is I want nothing to do with AML, KYC because liability is too big. I'll get it wrong.
Yeah.
And yet you're saying, even given all of that, it's still better in Middle East.
Yeah, on a grey listed country. I mean, that kind of blows your mind a little bit, doesn't it? Right.
Yeah.
So just to quantify that, in the Middle East, there are pockets. So not trying to teach anyone here to suck eggs, but the UAE has got like 7 emirates, okay? And only 2 of those emirates actually have what's called a financial free zone. And in those financial free zones is really where we find our international players going, because it has its own regulatory system and its own legal system for commercial and civil requirements. And it's very much based...
DIFC was UK law.
Yes, exactly. But only civil and commercial, not criminal.
Okay.
So in that respect, it's where the international guys go, and it's where the oversight of the regulator is much more stringent than potentially if we're looking more sort of onshore with the central banks and that kind of more of an environment. As I also alluded to, the criminal law in the UAE will still apply in those areas, but then it comes down into like your regulatory requirements. So you have federal law, you have cabinet resolutions, and now, of course, the UAE is pushing really hard to get off that grey list. And so there are definitely things that in the past we kind of knew were happening, probably not in those financial centres. If you think about the reason they were even established in the first place is because they wanted to be able to hold themselves out to say, look, guys, we are an international centre. If it's ever proven that money laundering was happening in those financial centres, the reason they were even established kind of just disappears, because everybody was like, well, it's the Middle East, it's a cash market, So it does disappear. So they've always been much harder on that topic than you would necessarily expect. So when I talk to US firms, UK firms about moving to the Middle East, one of the things that I have to talk to them about is AML, and their automatic reaction is, it's okay, we've got our group requirements. And I'm sure that they are actually pretty strong, but they're probably still not strong enough. So as just a basic example, if you were onboarding a regulated entity, you would still need to go through to the UBO and directors of that regulated entity. So you imagine you're trying to onboard a big UK firm that's regulated by the FCA, and they go, it's okay, guys, I'm regulated by the FCA. And they go, that's interesting. So who owns you and who owns them, and how far up the chain do we need to go? And can I have the information on the UBOs and the directors and this sort of thing? And they go, well, hold on a second, I'm a regulated entity. So there is an educational process that people talk about regulatory arbitrage, and that they potentially think, and I was the same when I went to the Middle East, I've been in the UK markets, I know the regulations, this is going to be a walk in the park. They have taken the UK rulebook as it was a few years ago at the FSA and watered it down and taken out some of the complexity. But actually, it's just made it easier to enforce, more understandable.
So there is a huge fund flow from the typically secret jurisdictions and the jurisdictions that are slightly whiffy to the Middle East, because question mark, right? If AML's tougher there, and basically you're leaving Europe because you don't like the regulatory framework, how is the money ending up in UAE?
Well, here's the question for you. Is it? Is it not coming through the UK and the US? I mean, actually...
Oh my God, the Illuminati. There's a money open conspiracy in London.
I know, exactly.
Oh my
I'm not going
God.
to get another job in the UK, am I?
Well, you should be careful. If we hear on the news some poor CEO of a compliance company is
consultancy of the
found
year, right?
20 stories down from a Canary Wharf tower block, we'll know why now.
Exactly. I mean, I have to say, I think if I was a money launderer, which quite obviously I'm not, if I could get my money through that UK bank rather than a UAE bank, guess what? It looks cleaner at the end of the day, no matter how much you want to wrap it all up.
I get the inputs and outputs to funds, but the wealth market, I've got a deal that I don't necessarily want to share with the authorities type market is now predominantly done in UAE with a non-jurisdiction, right? So it's somebody's money. They're just doing something that would have been secret in somewhere with nice mountains or flatlands just across the channel, but is no longer secret. But in the UAE, you can't have me back because there's a non-extradition treaty.
Yeah.
And it's much more secret there, right? So, yeah, I get that money laundering, i.e. cleaning funds that you can use to buy a large mansion outside Maidenhead or a horse or a boat or whatever, is better off coming through a dozen shell companies and an English bank. Got that. But I'm thinking more about the people that are starting funds are starting it to shield family wealth, to, I don't know, begin the laundromat process. It's easier in the Middle East, right? Question mark. That was a question, just in case there are any Middle East hitmen out there. That was a question. Not a statement or an assertion.
Not a statement, no, exactly. A potential observation, right? I think you
allegedly.
I think what you need to do is you need to separate the concept of the Middle East. You know, the Middle East is as big as Europe, you know, probably bigger, you know, knowing my geography skills. And everywhere has its own requirements and its own level of regulation. And for most firms that are at the moment looking at the Middle East, from places like UK and the US, they're not looking at onshore. They're not looking at the dodgy little Ras Al Khaimah, you know, entity where, you know, someone from a very well-off family just wants to park their money and it can never be found again. You know, these are, when we're talking about the Dubai International Financial Center, the Abu Dhabi Global Markets, these are proper regulatory environments. And it's surprising when people make their applications how detailed that authorization process is. It's more detailed than I've seen for the UK.
More efficient because the UK wait time's what, 12, 18 months at the moment?
Yeah, I know. And that's sometimes just to get a case officer, right? It's proving very difficult in the UK. So it's actually, I find it a very difficult sell for people to actually go that sort of FCA authorization route. Perhaps
which is fine by us because we service regulatory hosts and principles and we love people going there. I was just
about to say, it kind of goes straight back to your first point, right? That's why it makes a lot of sense to go these type of routes. Whereas what they have done is that once again, it's a smaller market. You know, you can't really compare the breadth of the markets, but it does mean that from the questions, from the understanding of the business and the ability to sit and talk to the regulator, you know, that interaction takes out like months and months of backwards and forwards with, you know, comments.
How long does it take to get, if you're organized and you've used Effecta effectively used Effecta to do your application in UAE ADGM 3 months?
Yep, it can be. It can be. It used to be
withholdings and that sort of thing. So do you have your 150,000 euros or whatever as reg cap, and do you still have the pillars and that sort of guff?
Pillars.
Whatever.
Make it sound like they're going to go to sleep. If you can basically think of the UK environment and strip out complexities, it still has, you know, those mandatory functions, your regulatory capital, you know, but they are now, it used to be like, for instance, if you're an asset manager, which is called a category 3C, it was taking anywhere between 6 months and a year. And some of the questions that were coming back, for these big international firms were just, like, come on, guys, this is silly. I mean, we still have to deal with that, of course, but they've become much more efficient as a regulator. And as consultants, we now know what are their concerns. So we're actually also being quite proactive. Abu Dhabi has always been the one where everybody says, if you really want to get quickly through, go to the ADGM. And I think they are still a little bit quicker. But Dubai is definitely getting a lot faster through that process. Equally, I think now people have a real choice to go to Dubai or Abu Dhabi because they both have now what are maturing financial centres offering slightly different things. So
personally, I do Abu Dhabi every day of the week because it's a nicer place to be, but I'm showing my age there as well. So we've got about 5 minutes left. Couple of questions. First one from Uma. I apologise if I said your name wrong. My bad English. What are your views about ADGM compliance? I think you've just said you like it. But as a regime, as a regulator, obviously it's the new kid on the block. UAE, Abu Dhabi have done what they've always done. Look at Dubai and gone, we're bigger than you. We'll have some of that and we'll do it better. Is kind of how they've done everything else. So I presume it's sort of the same. It
is a little bit. I think, it was well known that when the ADGM set up, the rule book looked very familiar. And we were like, look at that, even got the same typos. But once again, they have matured themselves, so it used to be, gosh, ADGM are very pragmatic. But now, it's moved beyond that. They've also got the big hedge funds coming through. They've also got backing from the sovereign wealths and people like that, and Mubadala has quite a lot of importance to play in that role. So people have to get it right because actually they're playing with the big boys there. And so I think that the DIFC ADGM compliance I think is comparable. But I think that they have got different focuses because they've got slightly different types of clients coming through.
Okay. And we have another question, which is one I love, and I promise I haven't planted it because it's right in our sweet spot. But what are your thoughts and opinions about the latest FCA article on improving the AR regime and the increasing role that data will play? Question mark.
Well, I think you need to get and talk to your service provider, someone like, I don't know, a fingerprint or something maybe, right? But, this, once again, it comes back to what we were really talking about right at the very beginning, the reason for those platforms. There's a really good reason, but also just a little bit like ESG, there's been some players that haven't done it properly, and that's not always helped the market.
I mustn't say anything. I mustn't say anything.
But equally, even if you weren't on a platform, that oversight, that's the thing, and if you can get the oversight right, what's going on, you can be much more comfortable with the fact that you are probably going to be complying, or if you're not, you're probably going to be able to identify it rather than the regulator identifying it.
And certainly my thought is that a lot of the industry thought that it had all gone away last year. So the regulator came out with its summaries. It said, we're going to ask you to register your ARs in a certain way. And I think the industry breathed a sigh of relief. There were some nasty bits in there. Treat your ARs like your employees, which I don't believe anybody understands apart from principals because they're doing the business. But everybody thought, we dodged a bullet there. We're still allowed to be reg hosts. It'll all go away again now, like it did in 2018.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, last Thursday, the FCA said, here's some data for you. We've sanctioned 4 wholesale regulatory hosts. We've got rid of 1,600 ARs. And I think the sound of jaws dropping in the industry of, they're not going away. They really meant it. This is a thing now, is quite surprising for the regulator because they have form of having a thematic, publishing something, ignoring it for 5 or 6 years. Look at the Financial Crime Guide. It was written in 2017, right? So I think my thought on the FCA article is, blimey, the FCA actually care about something. They're following through. They've recruited a team. They're actually doing something. And that, in the wholesale space, kind of takes your breath away, because SM and CR, all of that reg reporting that they did 3 years ago.
Yeah.
ARs and
It's been
principals.
quite
Oh
quick.
my God. Here they are.
Yeah, I agree.
Anyway, sorry, that was, yay, they're doing something. Great.
Yeah, exactly.
So Claire, we've been boring people for an hour now. Well, I've been boring people. You've been absolutely fragrant and fascinating. Thank you very much indeed. Is there anything you'd like to say in summary? Effecta, buy us because ...
Exactly. Honestly, I think people in the compliance world, I think you need support. There's so much going on, whether that be the UK, the Middle East. There's always lots of movement. There's always lots of opportunity to help your firms to make sure that they're doing the right thing. But sometimes you also need to just go to that outside person for a bit of a sanity check, but also just to find out what's going on in that market. And I think that's kind of where we position ourselves, is to try and get people aware of where they need to be, and they need to be in their tribe. They don't need to be outliers, and that's an important thing. And obviously, if anybody's looking at the Middle East, that's the area that I'm particularly passionate about. So I'm always very happy to speak to somebody about how that works and how you actually move over there.
Perfect. Thank you very much indeed for giving me an hour of your time. It has been fascinating. I think I've got myself cancelled 3 times on a hit list from the UAE, and the FCA will never talk to me, and people will want to buy stuff from you. So
perfect. Thank you very much.
That works. Anyway, and thank you to the audience. We'll be having another one of these next month. If after this one we can persuade anybody to come and talk to me. And so we'll see you in a month's time. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, James.